Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another AQCOLOR webinar. We're so happy to have Thibault Roland returning once again. This is his third webinar over the past year. And today, Thibault's going to be discussing a lecture on advanced techniques to fine art photography. Throughout the webinar, we'll have some intervals where we can ask your questions to Thibault. So feel free to send those in the chat, and Thibault will get those answered.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ali. I'm really excited to be here today again. And I'm even more excited to see that so many people are actually interested in fine art photography and some of the really cool techniques I'm going to be talking about today. So as Ali mentioned, there will be some sections when I'm going to be taking some questions, so please feel free to ask them in the chat. I will start this presentation by introducing myself very briefly, and then I will go over somewhat the framework that I want to make sure everyone is thinking of when it comes to this particular presentation, which really is to look at it through the eye of the fine arts. After this brief introduction, I will go into the really cool techniques, 3 of them today: long exposure, infrared, and tilt shift photography. That will be, so those 3 techniques are pretty much the meat of this presentation. Unfortunately, we only have 1 hour, and so you can imagine that I'm not going to be able to go into every single detail on every single one of those presentations. If you do have questions, I'm happy to give you more details, but I do also have presentations that are pretty much 1 hour long for each one of those topics. And depending on how much time we have at the end, I hopefully will be able to share a few of my images that, as you will see, have been captured using these different techniques. So let's start with telling you a little bit more about myself. I'm originally from France. I'm currently based in Portland, Oregon in the US, and I am very, very lucky to be supported by a few different great companies. Obviously BenQ, but I am also one of the Sony Artisans of Imagery, and I work very closely with some filter manufacturers and so on and so forth. I would define myself as being a fine art photographer, primarily focusing on seascapes, architecture, and landscape photography. About 95% of my work currently is in black and white, although I am working on some new material that may be in color. And about 99% of everything you'll see that I have created has some sort of long exposure flavor to it. So let's talk a little bit about fine arts in general, kind of as a way to go into fine art photography. So when we talk about fine arts in general, one of the very clear common denominators between all the different techniques in the fine arts is that the artists will basically depict a subject in a very subjective way, so to speak, in a way that's very much tied to a personal expression and interpretation. And it's not going to be generally speaking, about documenting reality. And here you can see actually 2 sets of images. On the top right-hand corner, you have different pieces of art that were made by Edgar Degas, who was primarily a painter from the 19th century. But as you can see, he actually really did all kinds of different art media. And what he was very much interested in, at least for this particular series of arts, was, dancers, ballet, and so on and so forth. And so at that point, it's really showing you how um, the approach as an artist doesn't depend specifically on the art type, on the medium that you're choosing. Really, what's important here is the theme, the subject that you will want to work on, and then you will basically be picking and choosing however you want to make that work. Because really what matters at the end of the day is the final product. It's not necessarily the medium or the equipment used uh, to get to that final subject. I won't go into all the details about the controversy on Marilyn Monroe's Im images by Andy Warhol, but this is another example of someone basically taking art from a different medium and transforming it. As you can see, it's very much not realistic at that point. It's not documentary by any means, right? It's all about the vision of the artist. So even though technically the type of medium and the equipment you're using doesn't matter as long as you have the right, as long as you get to where you want to be in the end, equipment does matter in the sense that it is here to enable you to creating what you are envisioning, what you're visualizing in your head, right? Um, if, say, I want to take a picture of, I don't know, someone running a marathon or someone swimming, I'm probably not going to be sketching that person. I'm probably not going to be using a large format camera because this is way too slow. I'm going to be using a digital camera, right? Because a digital camera will allow me to shoot this person in a way that suits my vision. On the contrary, if I am seeing a scene, let's assume I'm in Holland and I'm looking at seascape with boats coming in and out of a harbor. At that particular point when I'm looking at it and when I'm going to be painting that scene, there may not be a sunset, but I might decide to actually add that sunset at the end of the day because it's going to transform my image into exactly my vision at that point. So all of these different techniques and pieces of equipment are only tools in at your belt to pick and choose from so that you are actually able to create that image you were thinking about. So that's about it when it comes to the introduction. Let's now talk a little bit about some of those techniques that I'm really hoping you will maybe not necessarily be able to, at the end of this presentation, just go out and start, uh, using right away, but at least you will know they exist, and then you can drill down. You can get back in touch with me if you're interested. Um, come to some of my workshops or whatnot to actually learn about all these different techniques. And let's start with long exposure and some concepts about long exposure. If you ask different people, they will tell you long exposure has somewhat of a different definition depending on the person you're asking. But roughly speaking, they will almost all agree to this, which is that long exposure corresponds to the use of a slow shutter speed and intent to capture images on a digital or physical substrate. And what I mean by that is it can be a digital camera, it can be a film camera, it could be done on paper negative, it can be on all kinds of different media in a way. But what do people use long exposure for the most? Well, the most they will use a very slow shutter speed to be able to capture scenes that are very, very dark. So typically during the nighttime, as you can see in these two pictures that were shot back in France. Um, because I am able to use a very slow shutter speed, now my image is much better exposed and I'm actually able to see what's in my picture, right? The other reason that a lot of people will use long exposure is if you find yourself in a place that is very, very busy, typically a highly touristic place, such as this one in Paris, which is right next to the Louvre Museum, as you can imagine. Lots and lots and lots of people just walking around, standing, taking selfies in the case of the upper left-hand corner. Um, by the way, I forgot to mention that on the upper left corner is a regular picture, regular shutter speed, not a long exposure. And as expected, you can see all these different people very sharp in your picture, in this picture. If you're using a much slower sort of shutter speed, like you can see in the bottom right-hand corner picture here, you can see how people have almost entirely disappeared. Not quite totally, but if I were to increase my shutter speed even further than those 3 minutes you're seeing here, I can make people entirely disappear. So that's a really, really cool technique that will allow you to essentially feel like you're all alone in this really busy place that nobody else essentially would be able to do in any way except than just basically blocking off that place entirely, which is really hard to do. I don't think that the police would really like you to do that. Another thing that's um, very much used for by using the long exposure technique is to create light trails. So in a cityscape, for instance, just like here in Boston, it's very nice to be able to create those trails that are created mostly by cars, buses that are just driving by. Um, there are many, many pictures that you can find online where you will see basically these really cool light trails that are literally paved along the road and taking you into the city, right? Taking your eye towards the city. The other cool thing that you can do with long exposure is to remove distracting elements. Again, on the left-hand side here, you have essentially what you could consider as being um, a handheld picture that has a regular exposure time. While on the right-hand side, now you have a 5-minute long exposure. So you are, as you can see, able to transform this really busy foreground from the left side image into this really kind of dampened down but still cool foreground pattern texture um, into the long exposure picture here. The other thing that I am going to talk a little bit more, but you start seeing this in this picture already on the right-hand side. I am going to mention that again in the next few slides, is how you can turn your clouds into these really cool streaks, very fluffy and very soft streaks. And, you know, by combining all these different ideas of removing those distracting elements, so I'm going to be removing those waves on the ocean, by creating those really soft streaks in the clouds that I mentioned earlier, you're really taking away a lot of the details in your pictures, and you're in a way creating a highly minimalistic picture. As a side note, this is an image that I captured back in France. What you can see here is actually a sculpture of a really cool skeleton of a snake. Not entirely sure why it's there, but since, a few years back when I knew, I discovered it existed there, I wanted to go shoot it, and I finally was able to do that a couple of years ago, actually right before COVID. Um, and if I'm pushing this idea of using the sky and the long exposure to create those really cool streaks, you can actually see how you can use that technique to now create streaks that are going to be pointing exactly at the main subject of your picture. So it is going to be really helping the viewer of this picture zero in on the focus of your image. And this is a really, now it becomes this really cool um, additional composition element, and kind of a way to even frame and direct the eye of the people looking at your image toward exactly what you want. Um, and if I want to basically push even further this idea and combining them, you can see on the left-hand side, again, all the people are pretty much very sharp because I am shooting with 1/500 second, and it is a very fast handheld, essentially, picture at that point. The middle one is the 3-minute long exposure that transforms those clouds again into these cool streaks, but also transforms the fountain into this really cool, very, how to say, ethereal, almost drape-like um, pattern, texture there. And again, we can't see anyone anymore at that point. If now I play a little bit with editing to convert this color picture into black and white, you can see how I'm completely stepping away from reality. And this really gets me into the realm of fine art photography as I defined it earlier, which is pretty much opposite to documentary photography, where in fine art photography, I'm really deciding, I have this idea in my mind, very subjective idea of how my final image will look like. One thing that I just want to mention very briefly is that you may have noticed how parts of my image are actually blurred out. And this is because in this case, in this particular image, I actually used another technique that I'm going to talk about later in this presentation. And that technique is tilt shift photography. All right. So when it comes to equipment, and again, unfortunately, I'm not going to have enough time to go into every single detail, but you see here my typical equipment that I will bring in, the field to take long exposure pictures, depending on whether I want to take wide angle lenses or actually really zoom onto my subject. I may pick this or that lens. I do have multiple cameras here, but again, this is, and you will see that later today, because one of those cameras is infrared, something that I'm also going to talk about in a few slides. But what I want to show you here is that everything that's in green in this picture is all the equipment that is essentially required for you to be able to shoot long exposures. And as you can see, that's quite a bit. So it is, something that if you want to try it, you will have to somewhat commit to a certain extent. And if you want to really dive very deep into it, you will really want to have pretty much everything that I'm showing you here in green. So even though I'm not going to talk about every single thing, I do want to mention something, which is filters. Uh, every single image that you've seen so far, except for one, the one that I shot in Boston with the light trails of the buses and cars, all of these images, um, long exposures, were shot during the daytime. To be able to shoot daytime long exposures, you will need what's called a neutral density filter. A lot of people, especially when you're not too sure whether you want to commit to long exposure or not, will pick up what's called a variable neutral density filter. My very, very strong recommendation is to not use variable filters because they're essentially two polarizers that will rotate with respect to one another. And when they're rotated at the maximum amount, um, in certain light conditions, they will create this cross-like pattern which will be superimposed to your image. And there's pretty much no way that you can really remove that pattern from the images that you've shot. So at that point, your picture is basically just wasted. So what I do very strongly recommend is to use plain or graduated filters, such as the ones that you're using here. Plain or graduated will depend on the specific condition and specific subject that you're shooting. But whether you're shooting with, say, a square array or a rectangular filter or a screw-on filter, optically they're exactly the same. My preference is to actually use square filters rather than screw-in filters because those screw-in filters, when you're using very wide angle lenses, excuse me, um, you may be able to see the rim of that filter, and that will create what's called a vignette. That will not be something that you will desire, and that will essentially force you to crop your picture. Won't go into too many of those details too deep, but each one, the neutral density filters come in different flavors. They come in different strengths. You can think of them as being essentially just like lenses for your eyes, sunglasses for your eyes, sunglasses that may be stronger or lighter depending on the light conditions that you have outside. And that basically concludes the first part of this presentation. So if we have some questions, I would be more than happy to take them.
Yeah, Thibault, we have a few questions coming in. Here's one from Rob. It probably came in earlier. He says, if using slow shutter speed to illuminate tourists, besides being on a tripod, do we need an ND filter?
Yes. Well, if you're during the nighttime, you could make the argument that probably you can go by with extending your shutter speed enough that if everyone is just moving along, you will completely remove them. But if people tend to actually stay standing still for a while, or if you are shooting during the daytime, then yes, 100% you will need a neutral density filter. Absolutely.
Okay, and a couple of more questions from Rob.
Sure.
In a thorough photo of 3 buildings compared, do you maintain the f4.5 aperture for the 3-minute shutter speed version?
So that particular picture is a corner case in a way, because I was using a tilt shift lens, which changes the approach that you would take to shoot wider open than you would normally with regular lenses. With typical lenses, modern native glass that you will pick up from any manufacturer nowadays, unless there's very specific lenses like really super fast lenses. Um, my rule of thumb is that they tend to be the sharpest between f8 and f11 for sure, 16 maybe pushing it a little bit. So typically I would keep my aperture to something like that, f8 to f11, and I will change the neutral density filter. I have a whole bunch of neutral density filters of different values, different opacities, stronger or not quite as strong, to compensate so that I am able to stick to this aperture. And at the end of the day, when I'm picking the right filter, I'm always going to be able to go to these, 3 5 minute long exposures.
Okay, here's a question from Michael. What is the peak design straps and plates?
The peak designs, I'm sorry, can you say that question again?
What is the peak design straps and plates?
Oh, um, yes. So Peak Design is a company that manufactures a whole lot of different, um, how to say, different accessories for your cameras. So what you see here in orange is the strap, one of the straps that I'm using that is made by Peak Design. The plate is basically the plate that will mount onto the head of your tripod. Um, One thing that I didn't mention here, but that I do very strongly recommend, that goes with the plates or is the same idea as the plate, is to use an L bracket. If you're familiar with an L bracket, it's another one of those accessories that will do essentially the same thing as those plates. It's just so that it's very easy, very quick for me to mount my camera onto the tripod.
Okay, and a question here from Kent. As the
Mhm.
vast majority of your photography is black and white, do you ever shoot with achromatic cameras or digital backs?
So all of my images actually are captured in color. I shoot with a Sony mirrorless camera. I actually have a few of those, and all of them are in color. I do the black and white conversion after I've captured the image in color. So this is actually also another entire you know part of what I do, which I also have presentations, lectures on, that unfortunately we don't have enough time for today. But if you're interested, just reach out to me and we can chat about these things.
Okay, and Thibault, let's take one more. There's several more questions, but just to keep us on time, let's take one more
Yes.
for now. Here's one from Wendell. It looks like you're shooting with Sony gear. How does it hold up in the cold weather?
I do shoot with Sony gear. I have been using Sony for the last probably 8 9 years or so. I've never had any issues in the cold weather, and as a matter of fact, I've never had any issues with rain or shooting waterfalls or things like that. It The equipment does really well. The cameras do very, very well um, in the cold. Like I said, never had any issues. All right, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about infrared photography. So one thing that I didn't mention is that my background is in science. I'm a physicist by training, so I really like showing these graphs and things like that because they really help me understand better how things work. And hopefully I'll be able to explain to you how what I'm showing you here and how things work there. So what you're looking at here are basically a scale from the left to the right here that shows all the different electromagnetic waves that exist. Anything that go from cosmic rays, so rays that are coming from, the universe and whatnot. You have gamma rays that are radiation, essentially. X-rays that you guys are probably very familiar with when you need to check whether you have a broken arm or something. UV light. Then you have this really small slither of different colors that actually correspond to what human eye is sensitive to. So this is what's called visible light. And then it keeps going on. The next one right by on the other side, visible light is infrared light, and so on and so forth. What camera manufacturers want to do is to sell you their cameras, meaning that they want their cameras to be as truthful, to be rendering colors as truthfully to what you're seeing them, right? Because if you're seeing images where you have the color temperature completely off, you will not want to keep these pictures, print them, or anything else, right? So off-the-shelf cameras are essentially sensitive to visible light. And in an ideal world, manufacturers would want those cameras to be sensitive only to visible light. In practice, most cameras are actually also slightly sensitive to UV light and a little bit sensitive as well to infrared light, which is again that part of light that you and I are not able to see with our eyes, but it is light that the sun emits and it's there in the world, right? So this is where, if you see those red arrows there, this is where infrared light is located, and this is what I'm going to be talking about uh, in this presentation, with a little bit of a twist that I will get to in a couple of slides. So just as an example, you see on the left-hand side a picture that was shot with my visible camera. As you're expecting, you see the sky is blue, the trees are green, the roof is red, and so on and so forth. Now let me show you what an infrared picture looks like when you are still using it in quote unquote color mode, not in black and white mode. As you can see, everything now is red. Because everything is red, one thing that is very commonly done is to turn your camera to black and white, because it kind of helps you see a little bit better what the images will actually look in black and white, right? Makes sense. So let's take a look at what they would look like in black and white. On the left-hand side, you have a black and white conversion of my color picture. On the right-hand side, you have also a quote-unquote conversion to black and white of my infrared picture. As you can see, there are some differences. There is more contrast in the sky. The vegetation is much brighter. It's almost kind of white in infrared. There's also more reflection in the water. And this is all because of infrared. If I am taking another example, this is a picture that I shot a few years back close to Boston, Massachusetts, of trees planted in the ocean. Won't go into the details as to why they were planted in the ocean, but those are trees shot with a long exposure, which is why you see those kind of like streaks, because the trees are moving. And the vegetation, the leaves are turning bright, just like what you saw in the previous picture. If I'm zooming in onto this part of my picture, you can see how you have these actual what I call ghosts of people. People were standing there long enough that you can still see a little bit of them, but not so much that they're completely sharp, right? In typical long exposure pictures, people will show up against the sky as being darker. With infrared, they will show up as being a little bit brighter, um, because it because infrared, certain cameras can get pretty close to that heat regime where infrared is actually also dependent on how much heat is radiating from a subject. So anyways, again, this is me being a scientist and geeking about it. The other thing that is pretty different from typical long exposure that you've seen before is that in regular visible long exposure, the ocean turns out to be pretty bright, in tonalities. For infrared, it turns out that it's fairly dark. It's almost completely reversed. So now it makes it very interesting to create these images that are going to be very different from what your eyes see. It's going to allow you to tap into this like almost invisible, so to speak, and quite literally invisible to us realm, this world. So how would you shoot in infrared? Well, there's really two ways you can go about it. The first way is to use an off-the-shelf camera that you will put a filter that is going to let only pass infrared light. So it's going to cut out all the visible light, let only infrared light pass. The other option, which is much more involving, even though this is not quite how I am showing it here, what I'm showing it here is basically the entire sensor being pulled out of the camera. On the sensor, there is a filter that on off-the-shelf cameras will cut out UV, cut out infrared light. For if you want to convert your cameras, what some people do, and I have suggestions of where to look for to have cameras converted, what they will do is remove that filter from the sensor and put another filter. That other filter will, for instance, cut out all of the visible light and let only infrared light pass through. Or you may decide to let all the light, both visible and infrared, through, right? You will be the ones deciding. And I will get back into some more details in a couple of slides. Very briefly, these are very reputable companies that will be able to be contacted for them to basically do the camera conversions if you want to dedicate a body to infrared photography. I'm going to leave this for another couple of seconds and then I will go to the next slide. All right, let's do this. Okay, so now if I'm going back to my scale that I showed you earlier, you still see how the off-the-shelf cameras are going to be sensitive to a little bit of visible light. I'm sorry, a little bit of UV light, all of visible light, and a little bit of infrared light. IR filters, because you're going to be blocking out all this part of the light, will only be sensitive to this really small amount of light. Because it's only sensitive to this small amount of light, it means that you will have to be exposing your images for a very long period of time until you have a properly exposed image, which means that if you're using a filter to do infrared photography, you will have to be shooting in also long exposure, which ties back to the first part of this lecture. If you have a camera that is going to be modified, that is going to be converted to infrared, you will see in the next few slides, there's many different options out there, but potentially you can get a camera that will be sensitive to all that light going from UV through visible and infrared, but also much more in infrared. So this is to tell you that there are going to be differences between shooting in infrared with filters, again, only long exposures, or converted cameras. In the case of converted cameras, you can actually shoot very fast exposures and you can even shoot handheld. So very different. So I have a couple of slides here that I'm going to show you, still with that scale on the left-hand side, where I'm going to show you for each one of the image that will appear on the right-hand side, which camera they correspond to. So this one is for an off-the-shelf, quote-unquote, normal camera. Straight from camera, no auto white balance. You see basically a picture just like you're used to. If you're using a full spectrum camera, which is how you call a camera that will let all the light between UV through visible all the way to infrared be captured by the sensor, you see exactly that. Again, not with an auto white balance. But then you have other options where you will basically cut out more and more of the visible spectrum. Here, I'm basically removing the purple in a way. And you see how the overall image tonalities and colors change. And less of the visible light is being detected, less again, and even less so now, which at that point corresponds to what you would be able to see with filters. So with filters, this is what you see. With converted cameras, you can see anything like this, basically, depending on which one of those options you pick. Now, if I'm showing you exactly the same thing, and I'm going to go a little bit faster because we don't have a whole lot of time for the last section, which I really would like to talk about. I am going to be using, in this case, a custom white balance. And you can see how, again, the tonalities and the colors are vastly different from a normal visible picture camera in the case of this image here at the top left. The filter would be the bottom right corner. You can see how the vegetation goes really, really bright, just like what I showed you, how the contrast in the sky also goes way up. And then you have anything in between. One thing that I want to point out is I use a camera. Personally, I have decided to use a camera that still sees a little bit of color because it actually helps me when I do the conversion to black and white while I'm editing my pictures. But there's really no right and wrong here. It's really all about what fits you best and what gets you to the picture that you want to shoot in the end, right? Again, pretty quick about this, just showing you the black and white version if you're desaturating the picture that you saw before. This is just to show you how when you're using the filters or when you're converting a camera that is going to be sensitive only to infrared and not to visible camera at all, you will have this really, really strong effect. And then it goes down in terms of effect to, the regular visible black and white from color conversion. So here are a couple of examples, and I think I have a couple others of images that I shot with my infrared converted camera. As you can see, all the vegetation turns very bright, and you can also see how the contrasts in the sky, as I mentioned earlier, go quite grow stronger. Still two images that were shot with a converted camera. You see still that really nice effect of the long exposure in both pictures with the vegetation. All right, before going to tilt shift photography, do we have any questions?
Hey, Thibault, can we answer some questions from before that didn't get answered?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so here's one from Peter. Thoughts on creating fine art photography in the virtual darkroom using photo editing software versus in-camera process such as uh, long exposure, etc.
Yeah, so my recommendation is always basically do it in post, because post will give you more freedom in terms of how you will want to edit your pictures. If you don't want to buy a filter, each filter runs for about $100 to $150 a piece. So it is an investment. If you don't think you're quite there yet, um, I do think that using the long exposure feature of your camera is a good way to, get a feel for it and figure out whether it's something for you or not. But you don't really have control over exactly how it's done. Um, and so my recommendation is that it's always better to do things that you have control over, because then there's way less, um, how to say, uh, space for errors, way fewer opportunities for mistakes. Um, and on top of that, when you do the editing, if you like editing and you're very fluent in editing, it's going to be more, um, how to say, you can do way more. It will be more freedom for you to do it in post.
Here's a comment and a question from
Mhm.
David. Your black and white images are stunning. Are you editing them using Photoshop, Lightroom,
Thank you.
or a black and white specific editing software?
So typically I use Adobe Camera Raw, which is very similar to Lightroom in terms of how it edits the pictures, for those of you who are not familiar with it. Um, Minus the whole library and you know um, sorting images and things like that. And then I'm importing them into Photoshop. Most of my editing is actually done in Photoshop. And I will also use some plugins. Typically, I will use a plugin that's called Silver Effects Pro. I believe now they might be at the 3.0 version or something like that. It used to be free for a while. Now I think you have to pay for it again. But it's very powerful stuff. And really, at that point, when it comes to editing, not there's not right and wrong. There's really just what works for you and what allows you to obtain the results that you're looking for. If you want to use Capture One to edit it, if you want to do everything in Lightroom, um, you know, as long as you're happy with the result and they have the tools that you need, I think it's perfectly fine. But personally, yeah, I do Adobe Camera Raw, then Photoshop, then Silver Effects Pro, and back into Photoshop.
And just one more question. This is from earlier on in the lecture.
Sure.
Do polarized lenses come into your workflow?
Polarized lenses or polarizer filters?
Uh, they said lenses, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm gonna go on a whim and assume that it's polarizer filters, which I may be wrong. If I'm wrong, please tell me. But polarizers can be very useful at times, including for long exposure, but they're making the whole process a little bit trickier because you have to put the filter on the lens first, adjust it to what works for you, then put the neutral density filter without touching, without rotating the polarizer. And in some cases, it can be a challenge. It can also throw off sometimes if it's not done properly. The um, estimate of how long of an exposure you will need to get a properly exposed picture. But yeah, so it's just a little bit trickier. It can 100% be done, and I've done it in the past. Typically, would be to remove reflections, see through water, things like that. Just like regular photography.
Thanks, Thibault.
Yeah, of course. All right. So let's talk about this third and last technique that I am going to talk to you about today. It is called tilt shift photography, and it's one of those techniques that actually was pretty much, how to say, native of cameras for view cameras, meaning way back, a century ago, like large format cameras. This was their bread and butter. And the main reason that people will use tilt shift lenses or cameras, and I will go a little bit more into that later, would be for architectural photography. And here I'm showing you an example of a picture that I'm shooting looking straight ahead of me. So I'm not pointing up, I'm not pointing down. My camera and my lens are perfectly looking straight on. And as you can see, I can't get the upper part of this particular building, right? Nor can I get this one either. So that technique is typically used to allow you to get everything in your field of view in such a way that it doesn't do this. So if you're pointing your camera up, I'm sure you're very familiar with that the buildings tend to converge toward, the upper and center of your frame. On the contrary, if you're pointing your camera down, now the buildings will basically have all these lines converging to the bottom at the center of your frame. This is because you're either pointing up or pointing down. So to avoid this, people are using lenses or cameras that will allow them to shift the entire field of view, and I will show you in a second how you can do that. In camera, it is not done in post. It is not using any kind of skewing or cropping or anything like this. It is just being done entirely in camera. And now you can see the entire scene and you have all your parallel lines perfectly parallel still. There's no distortion whatsoever, and there's no need for cropping your pictures. So even though cropping these days may not be quite as detrimental as it used to be in the last few years because sensors have so many megapixels now, it's still nice to be able to shoot to shoot images without having to remove any of the pixels. Or if I had to go from this and stretch out my picture, I would end up having this building very much toward the edge of my frame, my buildings would be way too, there will be no breathing room, and my picture will look very, very busy. Not going to be a great picture. So how does that work? There's really two ways to do this. But on modern cameras, there's actually really only one. The one way you can do it 99% of the time will be by using either an adapter or a lens that will be able to be shifted with respect of your camera. See how the body of the lens is way higher than the mount of the camera, or it is way lower than the mount of the camera. So in the case of the left picture, I'm shifting down. In the case of the right picture, I'm shifting up. Shifting up will typically be what you want to do to get the top of those buildings. But it is also possible to shift left or to shift right. I didn't show you, but it is also possible. So now what is tilt? Tilt is this very different beast where, again, you can use an adapter or you can use a specifically designed lens to do this. And I'm going to show you that in the next slide, I believe. As you can see, I have my lens now that literally is pointing at in a different direction than my camera. Over here, it's pointing to the right. Over here, it's pointing to the bottom when my camera is perfectly pointing straight. So I can basically point my lens any which way I want, up, down, left, right, or diagonally, right? So what does that do? If I am pointing my lens to the left or to the right, what I will end up having is what you see here, which is that my plane of focus, meaning whatever is going to be sharp, is going to be along a line that is vertical. So you see here how the statue is perfectly sharp. Everything on the left, everything on the right is becoming blurrier and blurrier the further I go from that statue. But everything along this line is perfectly sharp, including this pole here of the fence. If I am tilting up or down, now I am able to make it so that my plane of focus is horizontal. The statue is still focused, but trust me on that because I know it's a little hard to see. The clouds are getting very, very blurry up top, but also everything down below the statue is becoming blurrier and blurrier, right? And this is because I tilted my lens, in this case, down. So at the end of the day, what that means is that with tilt, I have a really cool, really precise way of controlling where I am going to keep my focal plane, what is going to be sharp. What's going to be sharp is going to be the subject in my picture, and everything else will get blurred out. So this is just to show you that it is also possible to actually combine those two things because of course it was just too straightforward already what I showed you. I'm just joking. But you can combine those two effects where you will be shifting the lens and tilting it, right? And now it starts becoming really crazy, but you can do really crazy cool things. And it is possible, everything that I've shown you so far was by using an adapter. So this is an old medium format lens This is my modern uh, mirrorless digital full frame digital camera, Sony camera. And I am adapting that old lens onto my Sony camera here. That being said, there are also very specific lenses that have these mechanical gears, essentially, that will allow you to tilt and shift. This is all done through the lens on the right hand side, while on the left hand side, this is all done through adapters. These lenses are modern. They're typically you're going to be able to talk to the aperture, control aperture and things like that, while on the left side you will not be able to control the adapter using the mount. That being said, the advantage of using adapters is that it is way um, cheaper than buying um, a tilt shift lens. Tilt shift lenses go for about roughly $2,000, while adapters and those old medium format lenses, you can basically get an adapter and a lens for maybe $600, something like that. So much better. All right. So why else would you want to do tilt shift photography? Well, in the case of shift, for instance, here, what I can do is decide to keep my camera straight on and shift on the left side, shift in the middle, shift on the right side without touching my camera, but just shifting the lens. And then I am able to do a composite, a panel of that picture that I wanted to take. So, and this is without touching the camera. So I have zero distortion. It is very straightforward to do. Photoshop, any other piece of software you're using will be able to do this very nicely. And because you're increasing your field of view, you're essentially turning your lens into an even wider angle lens, right? Like this lens typically was a 24 millimeter lens. Now it's maybe, I don't know, a 12 millimeter lens, something like that. So it's pretty crazy. And I can do that also shifting down, shifting in the middle. Well, in the middle, meaning really there's no shift at that point, and then shifting up. And again, I can just do a panel of these images, have a really, really wide um, shot. So that's pretty cool. Another reason that you would want to use tilt shift, and in particular in this case, tilt, is that yes, like I said earlier, you are able to keep one location of your image very precisely sharp, but it means that the opposite being true, you are able to make another location very, very blurred out. And that helps with removing distracting elements, such as you can see in the bottom of this picture. Another thing that uh, tilt lenses are very famous, very much used for, is to do this quote unquote miniature effect, where you would basically be taking a picture from pretty high up, say for instance, top of the Rockefeller Center in New York, looking down, using the tilt, it's going to look like you're actually looking at a miniature scene. Here in this case, it looks like this tree is really small and that building is very, very small too. So it's another really cool thing you can do with this technique. As I mentioned earlier, you can really focus the attention of the person looking at the picture. Here I decided that basically this part of the image would be sharp and the rest would be blurred out. Same thing with the One World Trade Center here in New York, where I decided to have my plane of sharpness, vertical, and very precisely located on that building. And everything to the left, everything to the right gets blurrier and blurrier. In certain conditions, you can actually also develop, mood by using tricks like tilt shift, in particular tilt in this case. When you're introducing blur, you really introduce this sense of mystery because things are blurred out. You can't really tell quite as well what's going on in the scene. It kind of leaves interpretation to your imagination in that case. All right, so this is the end of this particular section. So maybe we can take some questions as well. And Ali, let me know if we have some more time to share a couple other slides or if we're done.
Sure, let's take a couple more questions.
Sure.
I know we're a little over time, but here's a question about tilt shift lenses. Um, do the
Yes.
perspective adjustments from Adobe ACR or DxO accomplish the same thing as tilt shift lenses?
So yes and no. At the end of the day, you can correct with Photoshop and other pieces of software. But if you remember that scene from the beginning where I showed you those buildings, basically the way software would work is that you would be skewing, you would be pulling the upper side of your picture so that now the lines that were like this are corrected to be vertical. But it will make so you will have to crop out those corners that you don't want anymore because they're pulled out so much out of the picture. And by cropping out, you're going to be removing a lot of the sky, a lot of the breathing room for those buildings. So those buildings will now be bumped against the edge of your frame. So it's going to completely change your composition in your picture. If you're using in this case, shift lens, or let's say if you're shifting your lens with respect to the camera or the camera with respect to the lens, you keep your verticals vertical and you don't have to do any cropping at all. So now your composition literally is what you see is what you get. You don't have to do any cropping. It's done all in camera. So it may work or may not work depending on the situation.
Okay, and let's take one last question.
Sure.
Do you print your own images and what type of printer?
Yes, I do print my own images. I own an Epson, I believe it's a P800, which is the slightly older version. I think there's a new model that just came out fairly recently in the last year or so. But I do print myself. I absolutely 100% love printing my images. It's just maybe it's a little goofy to say this, but I'm very much into thinking that photography isn't really photography until you have your images printed, and it's so refreshing and so different from just having images live on a hard drive or on a small screen. So I'm yeah, very much proponent of recommending to print, and I love doing it. So. And if you go on my website, as a matter of fact, you can order some of my prints and so on and so forth. So I don't know if you want to go through one more question or if we're calling it a day.
Uh, so yeah, Thibault, I just sent your website address in the chat, so everyone has that. What's the best way to get in touch with you if they have any more questions or if we didn't get time to get through all of them today?
Yeah, so you can basically use the contact form on my website. I also have the email address over here, which is contact@thibaultroland.com. And that allows me to actually mention that I do have a few workshops that I am going to offer this spring. Excuse me. One of them is going to be completely dedicated to infrared photography. It is going to be basically an infrared 101 workshop on one day in one of the most beautiful state parks that has many, many waterfalls in Oregon. And I do have more in-depth workshops that are 3-day workshops in April, May, and June along the Oregon coast as well as Eastern Washington, where I will be basically teaching long exposure uh, infrared photography for those who are interested and have the equipment, or at the very least introducing these type of photography, just like I will do also with tilt shift photography. But if you do want to get in touch with me, yeah, you can send me a message through my website or just using this email address, which is contact@thibaultroland.com.
Okay, Thibault, thank you so much for presenting today. We're grateful to
Yeah,
have you
my
appear once
pleasure.
again. We hope it's not the last time you're a source of knowledge and
Me too.
to
Thank you.
So I just sent our sign up page to the chat. If you would all
Great.
like to sign up for future webinars like this one from Thibault and many more to come, just drop your email there and we'll notify you. But
Yeah,
yeah, on behalf of BenQ, thank you so much, Thibault.
yeah, and talking about signing up, I also have a newsletter that you may sign up for if you're interested in having some tips, tricks, and following what's going on with me. But yeah, thank you so much, Ali. I really appreciate you inviting me. Really appreciate everyone being here, and I'm looking forward to the next time.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending, and have a great night all.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.